Thank you. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us, William. Dr. William Ackah. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're at Birkbeck, aren't you, in London University?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I teach there the geography department, and I'm the program director for community development and public policy.
Okay. Yeah. So, do you do theology as well as geography?
Kind of, I suppose. Yeah, not in a very detailed way, but I suppose my research interest is African diaspora religion and politics. So we engage then in the kind of intersection, I suppose, between theology, politics, geography, etc. I suppose I'd more describe myself as a political sociologist interested in urban issues, as opposed to a theologian as such.
So that's the crossover there is probably why Anthony Reddy's suggested you for this. He's probably kind of thinking about the kind of religion side of it, the African diaspora religion side of things. Well, that will be very interesting to hear about. We can start at the top if you're okay with that. So so the first question is about what is your background and how did you kind of get to where you are in Birkbeck and in what you're doing now, the research you're doing now?
Yeah. So in terms of background, I grew up in East London in Walthamstow in the 60s. My parents came from Ghana to there, so I went to school in East London, very multicultural area. And I suppose I didn't really, though my parents were both Christians, I didn't grow up going to church as it were. I think it was when I was 16 that I got baptized into the Seventh-day Adventist denomination. I decided, that I would give my life to God. Then did undergraduate study in Liverpool, went to the University of Liverpool and did undergraduate study there. Then I suppose probably a pivotal moment, I suppose, in both my kind of academic career and then sort of theological career was then I went to live in Haiti for a year. I taught English at the Adventist University of Haiti, Haiti being the first independent Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. Had a very powerful history, which I didn't know so much about at the time, but going there, seeing the experiences of Black people, of African descendant people, and what had happened to them, given that they'd had such a storied history of liberation and of overcoming the might of Western imperialism, but was now a country that was kind of mired in poverty, mired in underdevelopment, and really neglected. It gave me a desire to want to work for the improvement of marginalised and African descendant people. So when I came back from Haiti, I did a master's degree that focused on Pan-African studies, which is kind of looking at ways in which one could create links between Black people across the globe. And so it was from there that I then started looking for kind of academic work, and I think we'll talk a bit about that later, the kind of struggles in terms of academic career and focus. But I couldn't get a permanent academic job, but I started working in community colleges, community settings in Liverpool, doing work there. Then eventually got a job in a place called Edge Hill College, now Edge Hill University, teaching race equality there. And then I was doing my PhD at the University of Manchester at the time. I had to move away from Liverpool, moved to Bristol. Couldn't get a job as an academic in Bristol. Ended up doing some academic administration. And then I managed to complete my PhD and then get a job at Birkbeck. And up until that time, the focus of my work had been much more the politics of African descendants. And then my PhD was also about Black community politics in Liverpool and Manchester. And so that's how I got the job at Birkbeck, teaching community development, thinking about marginalised communities and how one empowers them. And I had almost like a sort of separation of thinking about my religious life, almost maybe in a very British way. My religious life was private and my academic work and other work was quite public. But then I can't remember how it happened, but I thought, no, it's about time that I really thought about the church and church life and its engagement and how to bring my faith life and my academic life together. So that's when I went searching, and that was when I discovered Anthony Reddy and Robert Beckford and scholars like that. And I think they were running with the Black Theology Forum. I think it had started before, and then Anthony was running. So I used to travel from Bristol to Birmingham every month to get an education in Black theology, essentially, and then ensconce myself into that world of learning. And so that's, in a sense, how I then got my education in theological issues and questions from a Black perspective, which then enabled me to start to write and to produce work in that area. And then the other pivotal moment, I suppose, came in 2009. In fact, my wife had passed away earlier in 2008, and I'd been given time off. So I went to America at the time of President Obama's inauguration. And I went to meet a scholar whose work I'd been reading, Professor R. Drew Smith, who was at Morehouse College in Atlanta. We've done work on African-American churches, post-civil rights, and the role of clergy in politics, because that was one of the areas I was interested in pursuing. So I went to Atlanta to meet him. So I went to Washington to the inauguration, had relatives there. And then I went to Atlanta, and he wasn't there. So, but actually, he spoke to me on the phone, and then we kept a dialogue. And then the following year, he invited me to Chicago, where he then had moved, and we reflected. And it was a conference reflecting on the 40th anniversary of James Cone's book, Black Theology and Black Power. And James Cone was the keynote speaker, and I was part of a panel that responded to him in the afternoon. And it was myself, another person from Atlanta, and then a colleague from South Africa, Professor Rothney Tshaka. And during the course of the couple of days that we were there, we started talking about how can we have dialogues that reflect on Black church experience in these different contexts, and how churches can look towards improving lives and experience for people of African descent. And it was from there that we started what's now become the Transatlantic Round Table on Religion and Race, which has now grown and mushroomed from that very small beginnings, conversation between like maybe 5 or 6 of us in 2010, to a much bigger international organization, which has, we have about 150 people come to our conferences. We produce books and publications, done campaigns, all about thinking about how churches and other faith-based institutions and organizations can be concerned about issues of social justice for African descendant people, but also for other marginalized people and groups. So I've held conferences now in Ghana, in Trinidad, in the United States, in Kenya, in London twice, in South Africa twice, and the network is so quite a growing and a powerful network. It's a powerful voice.
And so is Anthony Reddy involved with that as well?
Yes, yeah. So
And
yeah, so Anthony,
Robert
yeah.
Beckford and people as well.
Yeah, so they both spoke at conferences. So Anthony spoke at the inaugural conference actually in South Africa in 2011 at University of South Africa in Pretoria. Yeah, and Robert has spoken a couple of times at our London conferences that we've held. Yeah,
and that's called the Round Table.
So Transatlantic Round Table on Religion and Race, TRRR.
Okay. I have to look that up later. On religion and race, Transatlantic Round Table on Religion and Race. That's really interesting. Cool, brilliant. And that's been going since 2011.
Yes, yeah.
That's really good. That's really good. Okay, well, thank you for that kind of background. So could you tell us a little bit about the theologians that inspire you? Maybe, Robert Beckford and Anthony would be in those. It's a good place to come, Birmingham. That's where I am. So.
Okay. Yeah, so certainly, they were very, and continue to be, quite inspirational figures. Like I say, I suppose in a sense, because I'm not the sort of conventional theologian in terms of their training and things. So it's my sort of theologians that inspire me, or in a sense, activists, writers, academics, preachers, that they generally tend to be the people that inspire me in that way and motivate. So music tends to be a quite very inspirational thing. And as I was even thinking about theological issues and thinking about the questions you were raising, like the music of Bob Marley was very pivotal to me when I was sort of growing up and thinking about these questions of social justice and what happens in Black communities. So as more conventional theologians, stroke academics, Cornel West, his work has been very inspirational to me, and particularly again that focus on social justice, and that one's Christian faith, if it's to be meaningful and to make a real difference in the world, then it must speak into these issues of marginalisation and speaking up for oppressed people, regardless in a sense, of their ethnic background, their gender, their sexual orientation. One, Christ lived his life on behalf of the marginalised and the oppressed. That the thing that sort of motivates Black theology comes out of the sort of James Cone school of discourse, but in a sense, taking that, slightly further in that regard. African theologians also proven very influential to me. Mercy Odioye and the Circle of African Women, her work, proven important to me. Again, Lamin Sane, kind of opening up the space of Christianity to show that it's a global faith, and that African and Black presence has been so pivotal and important in opening up those spaces. Now, say more broadly, writers like Bell Hooks have been very influential. Her work on love and salvation, so though not specifically from a Christian perspective, again, really opening up space. That Black womanist perspective is very inclusive and makes one reflect, I think, and sort of search deeper in terms of personalized ethics alongside one's kind of more broader social and political ethics. So they've been very important to me. So it's also activists. So activists, preachers and activists. So being chair of the Transatlantic Round Table on Religion and Race, I've had the opportunity to travel to quite a few places. And what I describe as probably maybe one of our sister organisations is called the Samuel Dewitt Proctor Conference. And there you've got huge numbers of progressive African American churches and leaders that come together again to look at issues of social justice, prison reform and ending mass incarceration. And the director of that, Ivor Carruthers, proved very inspirational, and the chairs, the two people that founded it, Dr. Freddie Haynes and Dr. Jeremiah Wright. Again, just very inspirational in terms of how to make one's faith live in terms of activism, to be there on behalf of marginalised and oppressed people, and that the work that one produces should speak into those issues. So again, not preaching for preaching's sake, not doing academic work for academic sake. Whenever I go to those meetings, it sort of inspires me to think, yes, you know, your work needs to speak into these broader purposes. Don't just write dusty books to sit on the shelf. Don't just speak at events for academic kudos, but that what you do should make a difference. And those people, those kinds of events, inspire me to think in that way. So it's quite an eclectic mix of figures and people from across Africa and the African diaspora that I suppose that inspire my work and the way I think about these issues.
Yeah, it's very exciting to hear about some of this, progressive work that's being done, across the Atlantic and across the world. It's really, really exciting. Yeah, definitely can look into some of that later.
Yeah, because that's the thing. I think sometimes it gets hidden or masked because the preachers that one sees on television or that get their publicity tend to be those that are engaged in prosperity theology or other kinds of theology that then give churches and theology a bad name. But obviously there's a huge tradition of progressive theology, that emerges, I suppose, through being in the civil rights movement in the US, but also in other areas, in decolonial movements in Africa, and if you think about anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa and the role of Alan Bosak, the role of certain churches in those eras. So in a sense, it's taking on that mantle and seeing how that mantle can be moved forward, I think, in the 21st century.
And there was a lot of crossover, wasn't there, with the gay rights struggle and actually Black liberation struggles in South Africa and in the States, I think, as well, because one of the closest people to Martin Luther King was Bayard Rustin, who was involved in LGBT rights struggles as well, I think. And in South Africa, I think there were also people involved in both. So yeah, there's definitely lots of crossover, really exciting stuff.
Yeah,
liberation.
Yeah, certainly in that sense. Yeah, that liberation seeking liberation from all those things that oppress and marginalise and seek to stigmatise and to demean and to lift up those things here become quite crucial. And obviously not all elements of Christianity or other faiths and faith life have that progressive instinct. So it's trying to draw that out and to use biblical tools and other tools to really bring that to the fore. So that's why, in a sense, in terms of thinking about inspirational figures, yes, some of those are theologians in the traditional sense, but then I think also one looks beyond that traditional theology to wherever those sources of inspiration are that are speaking into those conditions. So again, Audre Lorde, for me, again, is another powerful figure. Work around, the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. Again, using those tools to think about these issues.
And I've heard of Bell Hooks. Does she write it in small letters?
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
And she's a secular author, is she?
I'd say she's academic, I suppose, a spiritual author. I'd say her work is kind of infused in spirituality, but with Buddhist influences, Christian influences. But in a sense, I suppose when you read the work, you can't kind of say it's not pigeonholed in a defining thing, but that those broader questions of love, justice, equality really shine through the work. And in a sense, that's what I love about it, because in a sense it forces you to think about those things, but then to take off, in a sense, any kind of denominational or faith-based straitjacket, and to think much more broadly and inclusively about these issues.
Is she American? Yeah, I've definitely heard of her, but like a lot of things, I'm not quite sure where I've heard of her or where I've come across her before. But what I like about this series actually is that it's giving me, and I'm sure loads of other people watching, our supporters, all these different avenues to explore, and I think that's really exciting. Because everyone we talk to has more people that they talk about, so that's really good. Okay, well, we'll move on to the next question then. So I've put about not just the theologians that inspire you, but also could you tell us a little bit more about your specialist area of work? I'm not sure if we've kind of covered that, but if you think there's anything else you want to say, if you've written anything that might be of interest to people. Or...
So I suppose I'd describe my specialist area of work as politics and religion across Africa and the African diaspora, primarily around the African diaspora. So with the Transatlantic Round Table on religion and race, so we've produced, I always forget now, probably 3 or maybe 4 edited volumes of work. I'm trying to remember some of these. So, churches, blackness and contested multiculturalism, Europe, Africa and North America. And so that was with my colleague Drew Smith, myself and Professor Anthony Reddy. He was one of the editors of that volume. Then we've got contesting post-racialism, conflicted churches in the United States and South Africa.
Do you have them there with you? Are you looking at them?
Yes.
Could you possibly hold them up so that we can see? Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Is that visible? Can you see?
Contesting post-racialism.
Yeah. And then you've got churches, blackness and contested multiculturalism. And then our latest one, which itself religion, culture and spirituality in Africa and the African diaspora. So
and
that
was coming out of the round table, are they? These books?
Yes, So it's coming out of the conferences, bringing together the work of the scholars and people that have presented at those conferences, and then collating them, into those volumes. I should probably talk about a bit of the work that I'm trying to focus on currently. So 2017, I spent a year as a Fulbright research scholar in Pittsburgh in the United States. That's where my colleague, Professor Drew Smith, who we started the roundtable together with, that's where he's now based. And so there I was looking at the impact of gentrification on African American church congregations. And so that's something that I'm trying to work on at the moment, and we'll sort of produce future publications around that theme, thinking about Black space and about Black spiritual spaces in terms of what they produce in relation to cultural product. So we often hear in terms of many singers coming out of Black church traditions, but actually what is it about that space that produces those things? What is it about those spaces that can produce your doctors, your teachers, your lawyers, your cleaners, that bring about those sources of activism? And even in a context like Britain, where we see the emergence of new African Pentecostal churches and how they've kind of transformed office blocks, shops, to create these new spaces. But then what happens to those spaces when gentrification comes in, and then those churches then have to move. Those people get displaced. So I'm interested in those questions in the sense, yeah, how what a spiritual life, Black presence, Black culture bring to cities and to urban contexts and urban environments, in terms of how that culture gets reproduced. And then also what happens when those cultures, those spaces and places get displaced. What happens to the people, what happens to the communities. So they're the things that I'm interested in exploring. And I suppose it's part of that similar project of thinking about how do we think about Black cultures, Black spaces, empowering those spaces, empowering those people in the face of racism and the issues that they faced. So maybe one other book or chapter that I wrote that people might be interested in is something called Ethics from the Underside, and that's in the Routledge Handbook of Ethics and International Relations. The whole book is a huge
thing, yeah.
But I've got a chapter in there in the religion section, thinking about ethical issues from the position of marginalised and oppressed people, and what does our ethics look like in the face of the challenge of enslavement and colonialism, and the fact that a lot of the ethical principles, documents, institutions that we look to for ethical values and guidance, that they were formed during those periods, and they've been used in a sense to dehumanize and marginalize people of African descent. So what is our response to that? So then I discuss issues of the need for reparations and the need for repair in order for, in a sense, for those institutions to have any credibility, not in terms of, I suppose, the Black experience, but in terms of their own ethical values. When you say that you're for equality and for justice, and yet you've marginalised and dehumanised Black bodies for centuries.
Yeah, when I'm speaking to churches, I often speak about the idea that actually the church needs marginalised people to redeem and restore it, actually, to what it should be. So maybe that's the same kind of idea of restoration. It's actually, yes, it's doing the right thing towards people that have been harmed, but it's like the only way that actually everybody can be restored properly from this kind of wrongness that exists, you know. And I don't know what do you think restoration looks like? What does it involve, do you think? And reparations. Reparations is the word, isn't it?
Yeah. I think it could involve. I suppose it could involve a number of things depending on which institution we're talking about. I suppose my thing would be is that each institution should look at its history and what it's done, and then work with those communities to bring about appropriate restoration. So whether that is financial remuneration or restitution, whether it's educational opportunities and educational restitution and making things good, I think that has to, in a sense, be the way forward, where there's a kind of an acknowledgement that something wrong and terrible has happened, as opposed to sort of hiding it under the carpet. And I draw on the Zacchaean principle, isn't it? That Zacchaeus was the tax collector, and then when he met Christ, isn't it? He said, "Oh, well, if I've wronged anybody, I'm going to pay back, 5 times, and if I owe people, I'm gonna pay back." So acknowledging a wrong, then making that wrong right. And I suppose in those histories of enslavement and the church's involvement in enslavement means that so to acknowledge a wrong and make something right. So that if that means then you've got to put church resources into empowering Black communities that have been the victims of enslavement, then you need to think about doing that, making tangible, concrete steps in a sense, and that's for the church, but say for other institutions, for banks, for educational institutions, for cultural institutions, they also need to look at their legacy. Yeah. If you say that Black Lives Matter, it can't just be a slogan. If our lives are important and valued, then one has to look at the history of the devaluing and the dehumanization of those lives, and then make restitution.
Yeah, it's such a strange and kind of sickening thing, really, that the only people that ever got restoration were the slave owners. You know.
Yeah.
And it's almost like there were two messages being sent. You know, it's wrong, so we're going to stop. But it's also, you know, we're also going to make up for the fact that they have lost this income in something that we're saying is wrong. It's like, it doesn't make any kind of ethical sense, does it really?
No, yeah. And particularly I think in that, like I say, in that British context, yeah, that slave owners were compensated. Those that were enslaved didn't get any compensation.
No.
And then when it's raised in the contemporary, it's almost like to say, well, that was history. You know, don't think about history. Don't think about the past. Let's look to the future. But if there was ever a nation that thought about its history, it's Britain. But it seems that it only wants to talk about certain kinds of history. You know, Jane Eyre, Jane Austen, period dramas, whereas it's more horrible past that's almost lurking behind the scenes. It never wants to talk about those things and address those things. So in a sense, until there's an honest conversation about those things, then we're always going to be sort of stuck. And I think, and as this is a inclusive church, we're thinking about the church, we're thinking about faith-based, you would think that faith-based people shouldn't need to feel, in a sense, the pressure of campaigns and the pressure of activism in order to act, because in a sense we have deeper motivations that come from the gospel. But unfortunately, what tends to happen is, yes, again, is that even that churches and faith-based institutions, we're comfortable. So again, only activism tends to push people to then make the right decisions that they wouldn't have made otherwise.
Yeah, and I think with churches, often theology helps, but actually story helps even more sometimes, doesn't it? You know, your own personal stories and things. It's kind of got to be like a combination, really, to motivate churches to act and do things better. Yeah, oh, that's really interesting. Okay, so now we've got this question. Can you tell us more about your experience of being Black in British society? Well, you kind of started a little bit, haven't you? And also in academia generally today.
Yeah, so I suppose it's interesting. Maybe I'll do it this way. It's almost like comparing kind of maybe British and my kind of American experiences. In that, at the social level in Britain, growing up in London and growing up in different places, it's very kind of rich, multicultural environment. So had a lot of friends, still have a lot of friends from many different backgrounds, which is kind of been a very positive, a very enriching experience. Friends from different faith traditions and no faith traditions, friends from many different ethnic backgrounds in that kind of multicultural part, which is London. I think would be very powerful and useful. Whereas in a sense, in the US context, life should be much more segregated at that level. That African Americans are in their one set of places, one set of institutions. White people in other groups are in other places, and so you don't generally get the same levels of socialization. But then one can then contrast that in the other way in terms of academic development and jobs, that someone of my level of experience and the things that I've done, it's been such a struggle to get jobs and to get promoted. So, and to be able to move forward in one's career. There's been so many twists and turns and maneuvers, whereas when I talk to equivalent colleagues in the States, that although, yeah, again, it's not a panacea, it's a very racist environment, that being a Black academic, the recognition for them can come quicker and higher, that their work, the things they're talking about, the issues that they're discussing, tend to be much more valued. Whereas the work that we try to do here, again, trying to talk about the Black experience and all of those things, tends to be seems very marginal and peripheral to the enterprise of academia. And again, it's only Black Lives Matter, it's only struggle and protest that now all of a sudden people are waking up to these kinds of things. Yeah, because I even surprised myself. I saw something on Twitter where chapters that I wrote in a book in 1996 on the need for Black studies are now being resurrected and spoken about as being something valuable. And it shocked me that I was trying to remember that, wow, so in 1996, I was in Liverpool arguing for Black studies, arguing for more Black perspectives in the curriculum. That's 25, nearly 30 years ago. Now we're still having those same debates, and people are now almost thinking, okay, yeah, we can listen to these things. So that really is quite scandalous.
Frustrating.
Yeah, and frustrating that that's taken such a long time. And in a way, that's almost like it sort of mirrors, my career. That you can be flavour of the month for a month, and then you can then disappear for such a long time. And in a sense, it's by having international connections is kind of what has kept the work alive, and then sort of brought it some, in a sense, the academic kudos. Like I say, that's not why you did it, but in a way, it's that has kept that work alive, and then enabled me to sort of sustain and then stay my job and to develop those things. So Britain, like I say, maybe on the social level, it's very good. People are generally quite friendly. I think in major urban cities, let's say that. But one's ability to rise in the society and to achieve what one's skills and capabilities should enable one to do is limited. I would say, that racism creates barriers and puts barriers in one's place. And because as an academic, it's a very individual, isolated career, oftentimes you don't actually see that that's what's going on, because there are not that many other people to talk to about these things. And it's only then when you start sharing and talking about your experience with other people, you realize, this is not isolated. This is there's a systemic problem going on that is blocking the pathway of Black people like myself progressing to the level that we should. And even as we progress, the amount of struggle, the amount of challenge, the amount of pain that one goes through to achieve those things is very wearing and very tiring in that regard, which then also has knock-on effects on your ability to produce the kinds of work and do the kinds of things that get the recognition to enable you to rise in the academy. So it has a double knock-on effect.
Yeah, I think there's a thing, isn't there, whereby I think sometimes people think that a problem is over when there's one step of progress, you know, like you stop slavery and suddenly it's all fine, and or you have kind of some civil rights achievements in the 60s, and then suddenly everything's okay. But it's never been okay.
Precisely.
Things move very slowly. And I think for too long, white people have we've just kind of ignored problems and pretended that they just don't exist. And I think maybe this is what the awakening is now, is that we're seeing, I mean, I know that George Floyd is in America, but we're seeing everywhere in the world that actually this is very, very deep-seated racist structures that we've got to keep on working at, you know, that these things don't go away. You have to keep on taking more steps and more steps. And yeah, I liked the idea that you said about was it Zacchaeus with the fight? He voluntarily paid back 5 times as much. Yeah, I like that, because I feel like actually when bad things have happened to whole generations of peoples, actually paying back the same amount doesn't cut it, does it? Yeah, actually you do need to pay back 5 times as much, because all the harm that's gone on generationally, you know, for people, it's just so vast. Yeah, so I like that idea of paying back a lot more than was originally.
Yeah, I think it is powerful. Yeah, and it's assuming responsibility and really, like you say, taking the extra steps to make things right. Because I think the issue with a lot of equality legislation in Britain that it's about the bare minimum. We'll just remove the perceived obstacles, but then it's up to you to, you know, scramble up and get to where you need to, but not realizing or not recognizing that those barriers and those obstacles that were put in place had a detrimental impact on the life chances and experiences of those people. So it's just not enough to remove the barrier. You have to put things in place to enable and empower those people to be able to come up to the place where they should be. So it's acknowledging, like you say, that those past things and those contemporary things have had an impact on the lived experience of minority populations.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's incredible when people kind of get upset with positive discrimination and kind of, you know, William, why are you not? You've got an easy job, haven't you? You've been given that job on a plate, you know, because of. But actually, your experience is the opposite. Despite the fact that, you know, some places try to do positive discrimination, it's still, you're working from so far behind in terms of structural racism that it only slightly makes it slightly better, doesn't it? But
yeah, and I you know, I think it's like I can't think of a time when I've had like any affirmative action that because I was black that the education system or the government or even the church said, because you're black, we're going to do this positive thing for you. No, every time it's like I've had to struggle, pursue and fight, and then it's afterwards, you did well to do that. You know, in spite of all the impediments and the obstacles. So we'll acknowledge you now. now that you've done it. So I wouldn't say that there's been any, and in Britain, like I said, positive discrimination is illegal. So I wouldn't say there's been really any marked, genuine attempt. And I always describe it as the opposite. You know, private school in the UK, into the elite professions, into academia, into the legal profession, into the BBC. That's affirmative action and positive discrimination for white people, because white middle class people, because they're the ones who use those tools that get them into those positions in society, and it smooths the path for them all the time into those kinds of elite spaces. And that's a direct entryway where you're schooled, you learn about all the things that you need to learn to be able to access those elite spaces. Whereas the rest of us, working class people, minorities who don't have access to those spaces, then we don't have those opportunities. So in a way, that's where the affirmative action is. not in a sense, where poor black working class people are given opportunities to access higher education. That's that's basic equality. And then where the real, like I say, where the real power, where the real resources are still very much in middle class, white, elitist societies, which has got coined in that sense of that term, white privilege.
Yeah. And if you're just trying to kind of get enough positions in different areas of work that reflect the amount of people, the percentage of people that are black or that are women or whatever in society, then you're only trying to bring it up to what it should be. And to say that then, as some people do, oh no, but it should be the best person for the job, is you're basically saying that white people are more intelligent than, or that men are just better, because that's the only kind of conclusion you can come to. If you don't think that women should be half of the board, or you're saying, well, then there are more men that are good on a board, then is that what you're saying? It's true, isn't it? I mean, so yeah. Okay, cool. So we've got, the next one is about the Black Lives Matter movement. And so what do you hope in terms of long-term successes from the movement?
So can you repeat that? I think it broke up slightly.
Oh, sorry. What do you hope for from the Black Lives Matter movement in terms of long and short-term successes?
I think short-term it's been powerful in terms of raising awareness, like I say, of kind of systematic discrimination, of the legacies of enslavement and colonialism, both in the sense at national levels within countries and then at the sort of global level. So I think it's done an important role there. I also pay credit and achievement to those people that started those movements, particularly when it was unpopular. So at the time of Obama, I think is when Black Lives Matter actually started, and the level of inclusion that the movement exhibited. So Black lesbian women at the front and centre of the movement, having a decentered model of leadership to say, we shouldn't be kind of privileging these old models, even that old model of the civil rights, where it's sort of black men at the sort of front and centre, and that kind of idea of respectability politics. So the fact that you had a decentered leadership model, the fact you had an inclusive leadership model, I think is powerful in terms of thinking about how social movements should develop and move. I think long term, it's whether it can actually achieve real structural change. And that's always the challenge, that actually in the material lives of Black and brown populations, will the movement really see, like I say, empower change? So we know, for example, like in the UK, COVID and its disproportionate impact on Black populations and that how those things then get tied to poor housing, poor job opportunities, poor educational opportunities. So will this lead to those kinds of structural change? So, like I say, so better housing, better employment opportunities, better health outcomes. They're the kind of long-term things that you want to see. But that, for me, that takes structural investment. That if structural racism is the big problem, then it needs structural Black empowerment, structural investment. And I use the example that, in a sense, after the Second World War, when Europe had been devastated by the war, the Americans had the Marshall Plan, where they threw billions of dollars to rebuild Europe after the war. Structural racism has had a devastating impact on Black and brown communities around the globe. So it will take that kind of level of structured empowerment, structured investment of resources in those communities to enable those communities to rise and achieve their full potential. So we're not talking about 1 or 2 years initiative, special initiative. We're talking that it needs decades of investment, decades of will at the highest and all levels in order for real change to be achieved. And that's difficult. But if people are genuine about that, then that has to be the direction of travel. And the problem, I suppose, what you see at the moment, which is why I'm a bit skeptical in terms of current governance arrangements, is that it's always about let's do a review, let's talk about this issue. Whereas, like I say, we've been talking about it for years and years and years. Now is actually the time for genuine action. And what I'm hearing, unfortunately, in the British context, like I said, at the level of government, is they're not seriously considering putting that investment in. They're still just willing to talk about it. And again, if we think about, if Black lives are so crucial and so important, like, for example, we saw with COVID, don't you withdraw your vulnerable workers first, and then you do the review and ask the questions later. If their lives are that important to you, you consider their lives to have value, you withdraw them from the front line first, you provide for them, you provide the money and the resources for them to be protected, and then you can do your research, ask the questions, well, why is this happening? Not, you will do the review, still keep these workers in the front line, so they're still disproportionately dying, still proportionately getting sick, and then you do a review, and then you don't really reveal the true extent of the problem. You just say, well, let's do some more research and some more work. That, in a sense, speaks volumes, speaks loudly, in a sense, as to what you really think about the value of Black lives, and whether they matter or not. And so I think that's the place, in a sense, where we need to reach, that not only to say that Black lives matter, but that in concrete terms, then that actually makes a material difference in the lives of those people.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, it's often the problem is that the economy is being put, sometimes being put before people, isn't it? Not in every case, not in everything. Maybe the government has done, but yeah, this is where the clash comes about. And you've got, it's the same with disabled people as well. You've got a lot of disabled people now being asked to come out of their shielding, even though they're very vulnerable, or whatever term you want to use, to the virus, and being kind of asked to go back to work, even though it's very dangerous. So yeah, people's lives matter more, don't they?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, and the fact that you find money for some things tells you then how much in place on those things, and yet you can't find the money for others, or you say it needs further discussion and we've got to talk about it. It tells you how important that you feel that how important you think that thing is. That sort of almost tells you that regardless of whether you say Black Lives Matter, what you're really telling us is that Black lives don't matter that much.
Yeah. And there's always money, isn't there? It's just that where's the priorities? That's the thing. And these reviews, what's frustrating about these reviews is that there's always been reviews previous, you know, that then it's kind of party political, and then the next thing or a new type of conservative government might come in from the old one, and they kind of do a different review again, and you think, well, why don't you use the review that's already been done? And yeah, it's frustrating. You need a non-biased review. If that can exist.
Yeah, well, my view would be is that actually you need a structured action plan.
Yeah, rather than a review.
We've had enough reviews, yeah.
We've had enough reviews now, it's true, yeah. We need action, definitely. Okay, well, I think we've pretty much asked all of these questions because it's about books and you've talked about books. If there are any other books or podcasts or anything that you want to mention now, before we move on to that last question from one of our followers, I don't know, do you want to mention any other?
I suppose in relation to Britain, I suppose a great book in recent years is Athol Hirsch's book, British.
Yeah,
not specifically a theological text, but I think, a very powerful explanation about why Britain is the way it is and how it's treated, you know, its black populations, and even someone like her, middle class, similarly privileged, and the struggles that she's gone through, and she places that history in context, I think, in a very powerful way. So that'd be an additional book. Yeah, I'd recommend, and the fact that it's very accessible as well.
Yeah, no, it's good. I had it recommended to me as well by somebody else a while ago, and I read it. It's Brit-ish, isn't it, with ish in the in brackets? Yeah. Okay, so this last question then is, what can be deduced about ethnic inclusion and diversity from the crowd assembled at Pentecost? So, logical question for you.
Yeah. So it's an interesting question, that range of diversity, isn't it? That speaks out that idea that it was Jews from all over the globe were there, which then tells us that the Jewish faith, Jewish religion, is also global. So the antecedents of Christian religion has always, in a sense, had a global identity with adherents from many parts of the world, and that, because in a sense that's the kind of idea that the scholar mentioned, Lamin Saneh, also trying to identify, to kind of show that the basis of our faiths don't come out of one particular part of the world or one particular environment, but they've had global influences that tend to be underplayed. And a colleague and friend of mine, Dr Gifford Ramey, who's, I think, he's lecturer in New Testament at a place called Birkbeck College. His PhD just been published, so people can access it online, on the Ethiopian eunuch. And it's a very powerful new way of conceptualizing that story, in terms of outlining again that he was an African Jew that had travelled to Jerusalem to worship. So he was already an African Jew before he went to Jerusalem. That's why he went. That's why he was going to Jerusalem. And that traditionally, that has not been sort of brought out in the scholarship. So here's an African Jew from an African Jewish community that is travelling to where he perceived that centre of worship to be in Jerusalem. And Dr. Ramey's thesis sort of powerfully brings that out. So not the idea in the sense of like the first convert comes from some alien place and doesn't have any roots in the tradition or roots in the faith, but actually when Philip baptizes him, he's already had a deep root and a deep immersion in a faith-based tradition, in a biblical faith-based tradition, as it were. So, and so then that speaks into that Pentecost. Then you've got people from all parts of the world that have an understanding and an immersion in a particular faith-based tradition. So it wasn't alien to them. So again, that speaks to this idea then that we tend to think, or historically or traditionally, colonial Christianity tend to think in this view that these places are heathen places, that these places don't know God. But actually, well, no, if all of these people from all these different parts of the world were there to worship God, they did know God. God was in their culture. God was in their experience. And so that's how, and so if it was there then, prior to the foundation, in the sense of what we might consider to be the origins of Christianity, then one might argue then that it's always been there, and that God then has always been present in those cultures and in those communities.
Yeah, and Christianity has for too long been linked with whiteness now, hasn't it? This is the trouble. And therefore, anyone who's not white, who's Christian, it's kind of assumed that they're a convert because of white Christian missionaries. Yes. Yeah. And I don't know if you came across, were you at Queen's when you came to Birmingham to study? Was that with Robert Beck?
Yeah, so the Back Theology Forum, was at Queen's, yeah. So,
yeah. So I don't know if you came across Mukti Barton, who used to work and lecture there, yeah. And she's written in our ethnicity book, the Inclusive Church ethnicity book, and she writes about how people assume because she's from India that she is like kind of a converted Christian, but actually Christians in India are older than Christians in the West. It goes back longer, possibly all the way back to the first apostles. So
yeah, precisely, and it's those narratives that need to be reshaped and reformulated so that they more accurately reflect the actual history. And I suppose we didn't get so much a chance to talk about it, but in a sense, that's the part of the decolonizing project, of decolonizing theology, of decolonizing academia, that some criticize as some kind of radical revolutionary thing to overturn conventional history, but actually those what we consider to be conventional history or conventional theology have those implicit biases and those errors built into them, and those mythologies become the received wisdom. So that's what decolonizing is doing. It's kind of challenging those received wisdoms to uncover the other stories that need to be told about groups and their lived experience, and how that they are central. The experiences of marginalized people that have been sort of written out of history, how they're actually central to these stories. And the Ethiopian eunuch, what was going on in Acts there, that they speak into those things, but it's almost like you need the right lenses, the right glasses to be able to look and see those stories in their proper context, and that bring out the great diversity, the great richness of humanity that exists in those stories.
Yeah. So basically, we need to read more Black theology and be illuminated in our understandings. That's what this series is about. It's true.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. And to have a sensitivity to the experiences of people that have experienced marginalized, experienced marginalization and oppression. To have an ear and a heart for the least of these.
Yeah, and that is a wonderful place to end, I think. Thank you so much. I don't think I introduced you right at the beginning because we spoke a bit before we started recording. I don't think I actually said that you are Doctor, isn't it? Dr. William Ackah. I'm not sure that I actually said that, but I'm saying it now. So thank you so much for being with us. And yeah, it's been really, really interesting, really good. Lots of food for thought and lots of things to go away and research. Thank you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it. It's been a good experience. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Cheers.